we have seen the former kinds of socialism brought about. We've not seen the socialism that you're describing necessarily, well, except for in small instances, and maybe not so small as I'm sure you'll allude to Mondragon. But
Right.
let me ask you this: in terms of structural critiques of capitalism, there was one seemingly non-socialist that existed at the end of the 19th century, this moment in American history of the agrarian revolt, right? And Lawrence Goodwin, a historian, wrote this great book. It's an abridged version of a much longer study, but a book about that moment called The Populist Moment. Let me read you just a quick quote from the book, and I'd like to get your response. He says, while the populists committed themselves to a people's movement of the industrial millions as the instrument of reform, the history of successful socialist accessions to power in the 20th century has had a common thread: victory through a Red Army directed by a central political committee. No socialist citizenry has been able to bring the post-revolutionary army or central party apparatus under democratic control any more than any non-socialist popular movement has been able to make the corporate state responsive to the mass aspirations for human dignity that mock the pretensions of modern culture. Now, is that a fair criticism of socialism? And can we achieve in the real world the sort of socialism that you're talking about without the benefit of a violent revolution, sort of Red Army takeover type approach?
Well, let's start with the first part of your question. Yeah, I mean, I say, yeah, it's fair enough. I don't like the long tradition of equating. I don't think a people's movement that sets itself against capitalism is the same thing as a people's movement that sets itself up against a revolutionary communist effort. I think these are different governments. They have different policies. They affect people in different ways. Yes, in both cases, people have risen up and been dissatisfied by them. But, you know, it's not what you're asking, and so I won't dwell on it. But I don't think they're the same. I think that there's a little bit of a facile echo there of the old argument that fascism is sort of one extreme, communism is the other, and that ends up with us in some sort of happy medium. I don't like that, so I don't find that all that edifying. Mm-hmm. But I do agree that in the cases of the Soviet Union, China, places like that, it proved very dangerous to build a Red Army and a strong state. I would remind folks, if they're not familiar with the history of socialism, that the reason socialists got interested in the state, which initially they weren't, they were very hostile to the state. They saw that as an instrument of the rule of the capitalists, and so they didn't like it. They had a lot of commonality with anarchists who didn't like the state either for similar reasons. But the reason they changed and became interested in the state is they saw that they could capture the state one way or another by the revolution or by political strategy through a socialist party. And then the idea was we could use the state, if we win, to make the transition from capitalism to socialism. And their model was the French Revolution. In 1789, the middle classes of France rose up, cut off the heads of the kings of France and all the rest, and used their control of the state, having taken it away from the old feudal leaders, to bring about capitalism in France. And so it wasn't so strange that socialists said, well, that must be the way to do it. The United States gets free by a revolution that's violent. The British break out of feudalism in the 17th century by violent conflict. The French do. Well, then that must be how this gets done. It wasn't anything surprising that they would reach that conclusion. Having said all that, I think your basic point is valid. If you set up a strong state, then you have to, together with that strong state, you have to set up institutions at the base of society, in the towns and the villages, in the workshops, the factories, the offices, and the stores, that have enough power to constrain and limit that government so it doesn't spin out of control. I like the old American idea of countervailing powers or balance of power and things like that. And one of the reasons I am interested, as socialists are these days, in worker cooperatives and changing the workplace is precisely to give working people at the base, where they spend all 5 out of 7 days a week working, give them the control of that wealth, of those resources, precisely so that they can exercise the pressure on the government so that it meets their needs rather than becomes another lord over them. I think in our society, the government does what the big businesses tell it to do because they control the resources of the workplace. Imagine if those were democratized and people really democratically ran their workplaces, then it would be people, the mass of people in that way, controlling the government rather than a tiny minority of those sitting atop a pyramid of power who are in a position to do that. So I would agree with your slogan because it leads to the conclusion that what was not done in Russia, China, and Cuba, although I should make a little asterisk here, Cuba is now one of the leading countries in the world converting government enterprises into worker co-ops. And it's going to be a very, very interesting experiment in the years ahead. They've been doing it for some years now because they've reached a similar conclusion, and they are converting their system from the state owning and operated, which is a copy of Russia and China, into workers collectively owning and operating cooperative enterprises. And so we will see whether some of these things I'm suggesting can be worked out on a practical level.
You gave a speech a little while back that was recorded by David Barsamian for Alternative Radio, and he titled the episode "The Market, a Paragon of Virtue." And you talked about a time before the market existed where we distributed goods in a different manner, and basically producers and manufacturers, they made goods and then they were sort of centralized and distributed by some sort of central power, either a king or religious leaders or the male head of the community or whatever. I think, and you said, maybe we could return to an alternative form such as this. Well, maybe not such as that, but that's my question, because I think that sort of puts your finger on what makes Americans somewhat queasy about the idea of socialism. This idea that if they don't have any engagement in the transaction, then they are powerless and they might be left to the whims of an arbitrary external authority, such as a central planning committee or another king or some sort of patriarchal society. What is the alternative?
Well, I mean, among the answer is that you have to understand what the actual range of alternatives was. I typically talk about that because I try to demystify the market to make people understand that the market is simply an institution that was developed in certain places at certain times, had an up and down kind of history, is an important institution now, but like most important institutions now, they weren't so important in the past, and if history is any guide, they won't be so important in the future, and it would be better to take a step back lest you imagine that they were forever and will be forever, which is a mistake about virtually every institution that we have. But in any case, having said that, here's some of the alternatives. Sometimes production was handled as follows. Everybody got together in a village or a tribe or a clan or whatever the size of the community was, and a division of labor was worked out, usually by discussions of various sorts. You'll be the baker, you raise goats, you raise chickens, or whatever it is. And then we go to work and we produce these things. And it was quickly understood if we're going to have a division of labor, if somebody is going to be doing bread all the time, then someone else has to make the shirt that this bread maker is going to wear, otherwise he's going to freeze to death. In other words, you have to, if you're going to have a division of labor, which gets you more output per hour, well, then you have to solve the problem of distributing the outputs when they are finished, when they are made by each laborer specialized in what he or she does. And then the human community has been very creative in figuring out how to do that. Here's an example that might make Americans more comfortable. You have a community leadership council. let's say, 20 people that are elected in some annual way to be elders of the community, if you like, or a city council. The very thing we do in our communities in America today, in our quote-unquote political life, would be now done in our economic life. That is, those people would be in charge of surveying the community's needs, assessing them, and then making what they believe to be a reasonable distribution of goods and services among all the people who had done the work to produce these goods and services, allowing those people to appeal or disagree in various ways, including electing someone else to the council that does this next year if you weren't happy with how it was done this year, et cetera, et cetera. There doesn't have to be a distributor who's at a great distance from you, some distant king or some distant war, none of that. It can all be arranged in a way that a community would be comfortable with. And if the people themselves control the work process, they're in a pretty strong position to make their views felt and their needs play a role in here. I might also mention, because Americans have, I don't know how to say this politely, a difficulty holding on to their own history, that we have in this country, on several occasions, decided that allowing the market to distribute goods and services is simply unacceptable. We won't do it, we won't permit it, and we're going to have the government do it instead. The last big example was World War II, which isn't that long ago. During World War II, it was decided that it was an important priority in the United States to win that war, at least not to lose it, and that lots of resources would have to be made available to the military to fight that war. Those resources would have to be taken away from producing consumer goods for the people at home, so they would be available to support the troops abroad. Okay, but what that meant was, with the reduced availability of resources at home, there wouldn't be enough sugar, meat, gasoline, and a whole bunch of milk, and a whole bunch of other basic commodities compared to the number of Americans who wanted and normally consumed them. Well, you could have let the market decide. That's a polite way of saying you could have given the scarce goods to the people with the most money to pay for them, because they would have bid up the prices and they would have gotten them, and those without the money would have done without. That's how a market works. We didn't do that. We did not do that. The United States decided to create a rationing system, and the government gave out ration tickets. That's what they were called back in the 1940s. And here's what they did. The government decided on a reasonable way to do this. You got more ration tickets, for example, if you had more children who were under, say, age 10 and were presumed to be more in need of milk than adults were, et cetera, et cetera. And so we distributed scarce goods in a way that was deemed, dare I say this, to be more equitable, more fair, more human, more humane than the market would have done. In other words, we recognized as a nation that there are, here we go, better ways to handle the distribution of goods and services than a market. And I would argue that if that was true then, it's just as true now. It doesn't need an extreme situation like war. It's true right now that we do not adequately distribute education, good housing, and lots of other things crucial to a humane society in an equitable way. We do it by the market, and that's a very bad thing both for the present and future of our country.
One of the things, Richard, that I think is so intriguing about your work and what you're doing with your book, Democracy at Work, and your website, democracyatwork.info, is the connection that you're stressing and drawing out between democracy and socialism. And that raises a question in my mind that I wanted to pose to you, because I think that's a great thing. But But then there's the risk of the tyranny of democracy, right? I mean, there were times in the history of America, for example, when if we went strictly by majoritarian rule, there would have been considerable oppression and injustice and inequality. What is your solution for the danger that comes with, the unpredictability of democracy?
Well, I think you're right. I agree with you. I think that I would say about democracy what I said about markets. This is an institution that was developed at a certain time under certain conditions. It didn't fall from heaven. It isn't perfect. It hasn't solved all of mankind's problems. It is a useful institution in many ways, but that doesn't mean there aren't aspects of it or aspects of its workings that we have to limit, we have to control. For example, that there has to be, and we've learned that, there has to be protection for minorities, for people who are in a minority, who have to then go along with the decision that the majority makes, but who have to have built into this system, as deeply rooted as they can, protections for a minority, so that it can't, beyond a certain point, it cannot be penalized for the fact that the majority think a different way. We've had to struggle with that in our country in terms of majority and minority religions, majority and minority ethnic groups. Some areas we've done pretty well in that regard, other areas we haven't. My guess is a democratic society, especially one that democratized the workplace, would pretty soon bump up against the limits of its arrangement and discover that it has to qualify or modify or adjust its democracy to protect important values that the community has from being somehow abused by a majority. And I think we can learn from previous efforts at majoritarian or democratic leadership that go all the way back to ancient Greece, but include our own country. So I'm hopeful that we would be a little bit better at it. The argument strikes me a little bit like the old argument in the South before the Civil War. The people said, well, let's free the slaves. And in the enthusiasm of abolitionists to free the slaves, they sometimes got carried away with their own rhetoric and believed that if only slavery were abolished, then the African-American population would be happy, and et cetera, et cetera. That was naive. It turns out that even after you're not a slave anymore, you can still have all kinds of discrimination and all kinds of injustices, and so we've had to learn that. But that doesn't mean it wasn't a good idea to get rid of slavery. In other words, it was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't the end of the road. It wasn't finished. And I think democracy is exactly the same thing, that we need to democratize the enterprise for all the reasons that we democratized politics before that, got rid of kings and queens and aristocrats and autocrats and all the rest. But is it the end of the road? Does it solve all problems? No, and I don't think a reasonable person should say it, and a reasonable person shouldn't expect it either. Life, as a wise man once said, is a process of discovery and struggle to make things better, and I don't think that stops when we have a democracy or, for that matter, any other institution. I sometimes in my classes, just a footnote, teach, when we study economics, I take the students back to ancient Greece, because it turns out that Aristotle and Plato, people considered to be the founders in many ways of modern Western civilization, they had a very lively debate with their colleagues about markets. And both Aristotle and Plato were critical of markets, very critical. Plato so much that he basically said they should be abolished. Aristotle said, no, by now they're so well established here in Greece that we shouldn't abolish them because that'll be too socially disruptive. But instead, we should rigidly control and regulate them so we get the good parts about markets, but we prevent the bad parts about markets. And that was then a widely held perspective. I simply say that to help people understand that having come 5,000 years since ancient Sparta and Athens, to a place where an inordinate number of our fellow citizens seem to think that markets are some sort of perfect institution that you can't do better than, sounds like it's a regression of the human experience rather than a progression from learning what has happened in the interval.
Well, you've mentioned in some speeches, the labor situation that happened at Market Basket. I'm calling from Portland, Maine, of course, so we're familiar with it here. And then also, the election of the socialist city councilor in Seattle, Kshama Sawant. And then, of course, you've got the Fight for 15 movement. You've got the Black Lives Matter movement. Is it your sense that we are on the precipice in this country of some sort of underclass uprising, some sort of workers' revolt? Are we on the cusp of something bigger here?
I guess my basic answer is yes. I obviously can't predict the future any better than anybody else can, so I don't know how this is going to work or where it's exactly going to go. I can't do that, and I'm not going to pretend I can. But I will tell you this. It's a remarkable fact. I have good friends who are right-wing economists, left-wing economists, and economists in the center. There aren't that many professional economists in the world, and I live in New York City, and a lot of them are here. So I know them, I went to school with them, etc. And we get together for coffee or dinner or lunch or something from time to time. And here's a remarkable thing that happens to us. We do not agree amongst each other as to how the United States got in to the current situation that your question refers to. And we do not agree on how to get out of it. But here's something which we surprised one another to discover we all agree on. And here's the sentence that we came up with. The United States is in a more difficult economic situation today than at any point in any of our lives, and a good percentage of us have white or gray hair. In other words, we are all agreed that whether you call it a precipice or a turning point or a break or whatever word you might want to choose, something is going on in the United States that is very profound, that is taking multiple forms. You listed a good bunch of them, and that is different from what we have seen before, at least in our lifetimes. And yes, so I think our economic system is simply not working. Capitalism, to make it clear, is simply not working well for the vast majority of the American people. A good number of us don't want to face that. We practice denial, which I understand. It's a human failing. You don't want to see it. It's bad news. It's like a little 2-year-old covers her face with her hands so the scary monster who might be in the closet is less frightening. I understand. We all have elements of that in ourselves. But I think with each passing week, more and more Americans are kind of growing up and facing the fact that whether you look at the indebtedness of your college-age kid, whether you're looking at the benefits your job used to have but doesn't have anymore, whether the insecurity of your position, whether it's the cutting back of public services in the community or the state where you live, you would have to be blind, deaf, and dumb not to notice what's going on when it continues now basically since 2008 at a very accelerated rate. It was doing it before, but it wasn't quite so palpable. But now I don't think you can miss it. And more voices are rising from all different directions, basically saying that this is going on. The language differs. This person says, well, the middle class is disappearing. Or someone else says, how can we burden our children with these crazy debts before they even have a job, et cetera, et cetera. Whatever the particular way people have, there is a growing coming together of a recognition that something is very, very wrong, and that something big, therefore, is going to be needed to correct something that is as basically amiss as what people, I think, are coming to recognize. And I'm doubly impressed that because the mass media, and I'm very critical of them in this regard, because the mass media have done such a poor job, in my judgment, about giving our people a critical literacy, a critical awareness of what's going on, good and bad, so that they can reach critical judgments that are needed at a time of difficulty. We've left our people grasping for what the hell is going on, so they can understand and make decisions, whether it's for their family or themselves or their community, that are based on something more than a hope and a dream, and have some grounding in what's actually going on. I'll tell you this, I travel around the country now. I do 2 to 3 trips a month, literally West Coast, North, East, South, every part of the United States and abroad. And I can tell that my audiences are at least as interested in my simply explaining how the economy works than they are in hearing my suggestions for where we need to go. They listen to the latter, but I suspect that the American people are playing a kind of game of catch-up, that they are wanting now to understand the economic system in a way they did not feel the need to do in the past, and that's because the system isn't working for them, and they want to understand why, and therein lies a very powerful engine of change.
One final question, Richard. I wanted to ask you this. Bernie Sanders is running for the Democratic nomination for president here in America, and he calls himself a democratic socialist. So are you supportive of his campaign, or are you more supportive of, say, a third-party candidate such as Dr. Jill Stein, who I think is the presumptive nominee for the Green Party for the president? Or do you feel that the whole thing is sort of a useless charade, that we would be better focused on other alternatives outside of this whole thing?
Well, it may seem to you to be awkward, but I guess I have to say I am happy that Bernie Sanders is running. I am happy that Jill Stein and the Green Party are there and running. And I'm happy that people are willing to openly question the whole election system we have, because I think those are all healthy correctives to a long period that I think will become known. Maybe it'll take another 20 years. It will become known in American history as a peculiar kind of dark ages after World War II. In World War II, we were allied with the Soviet Union. After World War II, they became the great enemy. And every kind of criticism of capitalism was swept away under the heading treason or disloyalty or foreign or something like that, so that all the healthy conversation about our economic system, capitalism, that a healthy society ought to have. It ought to have its critics coming out and its defenders coming out, debating, because that's how you identify problems and weaknesses. That's how you mobilize people to make the changes, to make it better. If you don't do that, if you make it a taboo or a pariah to have those kinds of discussions, which we did from 1945, basically even into the present, but at least until recently, what you do is you give your system a pass to indulge its worst instincts because it doesn't see the light of a critical day. And I think Americans are now beginning to make up for that bad 50, 60 years and are saying, let's have some critical voices. I am amazed at the response that Bernie Sanders is getting. The poll, I don't know if you saw it the other day, of Democrats in Wisconsin, 49% for Clinton, 42% for Sanders. The decision of the Vermont State AFL-CIO to endorse him and to urge the national unions to endorse him as the only non-corporate candidate. These mean that not only is Bernie Sanders putting himself out there, but what he's showing the country, what he's showing all of us, is that there are a lot more people now able and willing to look critically at this country, to make it a better place, and to stop pretending that we've solved everything, and as every candidate has to say, we're the greatest thing on earth, this sort of obnoxious behavior we wouldn't like in a coworker in our office, we can get beyond that and become once again a society that has the debates it should have had all along. And for that, I'm already grateful to Sanders, even if there are points at which I would go further and so forth. And the same is true with Jill Stein, the Green Party, and so forth. And I have never thought that the United States would solve its problems by voting. I find few of the major turning points in history to have been accomplished by an election. The election can play a role, and I'm certainly in favor of participating in the election. But I also believe that there's a great deal of politics that happens outside of elections, on the streets, in the homes, in the schools, in the churches, that are just as important to the final outcome as what we do in that voting booth.
Well, Richard D. Wolff is professor of economics emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, author of many books, including Democracy at Work. You can find out more information and connect with him and his own podcast at rdwolff, WOLFF.net and democracy.
No, .com.
I'm sorry, .com and democracyatwork.info. So Thank you so much for being here, Richard. Appreciate it.